let's continue on that line. You had a whole series on your Inward podcast, and by the way, for everyone listening here, um, Rabbi Joey, Rabbi Rosenfeld has incredible Torah out there online. His one of his podcasts is called Inward, and I really recommend it. And you, my son Yehuda, um, shared with me some of your episodes on trauma. Can you speak a little from a Kabbalistic perspective and how that also relates to your work as a rabbi and
Mm.
as an addiction therapist as well?
Sure, sure, absolutely. So first and foremost, before I even begin to talk about trauma, I always feel that it's necessary to make a clear cut between what may be identified as a clinical experience of trauma, which necessitates real psychological, psychiatric intervention based on an event that has taken place imposed from the outside, and the general kind of framework of trauma that I tend to speak about. This has typically been referred to as capital T trauma, which event refers to a particular event, which is a separate category that does not get spoken about necessarily in spiritual terms until it gets worked out. And then the lowercase t trauma, which is basically the trauma of everyday life. Now, there is room to say, I believe, that if anyone's lived past, let's say 9/11, or certainly the time period we find ourselves in now on various fronts, with grandparents perhaps who have, been survivors of the war, or knowing survivors of the war, or knowing about the Holocaust, I think it is fair to say to a certain degree that there's really not many people who can't necessarily identify themselves as a capital T trauma experiencer, to the point that we can refer to ourselves as post-traumatic subjects, meaning our generation is a post-traumatic generation, right? It's post-trauma. So the Torah of our generation has to be a post-traumatic Torah. And I think that from a Panemius oriented perspective, there is a very identifiable stream of thought when it comes to trauma, and that is that trauma is built into the plan. Meaning not the suffering associated with individual cases of trauma, but trauma as a verb, trauma as an adverb, in the sense that it refers to any event that takes place that is a direct shift or opposition to what I had assumed would be the continuation of what was happening previously. Any shift, abrupt breaking away from what I had expected to what is now present in front of me, is identifiable as a trauma. And so
even if it's not like what normally we associate with the word trauma, like God forbid, like
Bevadai, hearing good news can also be a traumatic experience, in the sense, I'm talking again, I'm not talking symptom or pathology now, I'm talking the concept of trauma. Trauma is a sudden appearance of something. The last year that I gave in that trauma series was this attempt to describe this very point, and the title I gave was the redemption of trauma and the trauma of redemption. Meaning that once a person frees themselves from the typical way we think about trauma, then we can come to understand how even redemption itself can be considered traumatic, because it's going to be a sudden shift from what we had expected, except for those who wait on a daily basis. But trauma is this sudden breaking apart of what was previously kind of created for something new taking place, something overwhelming. And here's where there's going to be a difference. In Panemius, Simtsum, Hashem's kind of, yes.
Just to translate the terms, Panemius is just sort of the inner,
the inner teachings of Torah. I mean, we could go into a full description of what that represents, but in the inner teachings of Torah, the trauma is constitutive, meaning it's a breaking that builds. Every breakdown is the preparation for an incoming breakthrough that necessitated the destruction or the falling apart of some previous stage, which was considered immature to a certain degree, even on a structural way, in relation to what is about to come. So the trauma, the breaking down, is always in preparation for a breakthrough. But not only that, it's not simply in the aspect of a preparation, but it is part and parcel of the breakthrough itself, that the broken pieces that are a result of the trauma are the very pieces that are utilized to rebuild and reconstruct a rectified version of things in a way that could not have been possible without the breaking apart. So trauma is part of the construction. It's a shvira. It's something that breaks apart. The center cannot hold, but in that center breaking apart, we come to find that not only have we survived, and we continue to move forward, but there's going to be a certain strength that is going to come from this. This is what is referred to as post-traumatic growth, which is hard to talk about when we're talking about the real symptomology of, God forbid, any type of authentic trauma or event of a trauma in the beginning, which is what we identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. But PTSD can when taken seriously and treated, can very quickly transform itself into a post-traumatic growth. And so I think that in Yiddishkeit, there is a recognition that things break in order to be built. And that's not a mistake, that's not capricious, but that is exactly how things develop. And from that perspective, all of us, I mean, birth is trauma. Being born into this world is trauma. The formation of subjectivity is trauma. You know, it's a severing away. And the Zohar HaKadosh says that one of the calls that reverberate throughout the very annals of history is the scream of the child at the moment of birth because of the cutting away that it's experiencing from its place above. Meaning that is, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing, God forbid. Being created is a very good thing. Right? This is one of my favorite teachings in the world from the Tzaddikim of Ishbitz, of Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Ishbitz, that Chazal, they had this argument about whether, they argued for 3.5 years whether it would have been more pleasant for a person to have been created or to have not been created. The language in Hebrew is Noyach lo la'adam shelo nivra yoter mishenivra. And they come to the conclusion that in truth it would have been much more pleasant for a person to have not been created than to have been created. And so what the Ishbitzer Tzaddikim say is that please pay close attention to the words themselves. It does not say it would have been better for a person not to have been created. It simply says it would have been simpler or more pleasant. And once a person is able to kind of accept that at the outset, that, you know, the pleasantness, the ease in which I'm going to experience this process that I call life is not necessarily going to be in line with my expectations.
I think, if you don't mind me jumping right in there, that I've had this conversation with students of mine who are attracted to Torah and mitzvot, were not raised that way, but it's more of a difficult life. It's more of a commitment. It's more of a, and I've said to them, like, it was like a joke, like, yeah, life was definitely maybe a little less pleasant, but so much more powerful and meaningful. Yeah. And the question is, sometimes there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off sometimes for pleasantness. And, I wonder if that's Bikesh, Yaakov Lashevet B'Shalva, that we have a tradition that Jacob wanted to sit in pleasantness, in tranquility, but that's not our task necessarily in this world.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly that at first glance, pleasantness and calmness is not our lot even. And Bikesh Yaakov Leshev B'Shalva, Jacob asked to have that, and he was told, no, I'm sorry, here's the trauma of Yosef. But I do believe that there's another level, which is the level of Shabbos, which is really just a state of consciousness, that within, once I accept upon myself the unpleasantness of it, and the fact that the likelihood of calmness is not going to be so present, then I can begin to find calmness even where it's not. Then I could begin to, it might not be pleasant, but that unpleasantness can still be by way of pleasantness.
Rabbi Soloveitchik Zecher Zolgavracha said that in his famous footnote 4 of Halachic Man. If anybody
so funny, I was about to reference that before you said it.
Interesting. Because, I was reading that, and I feel like as an outreach rabbi, it's like, this is the last thing I'm going to try to sell. I'm going to try to get young Jewish people to be more involved in Yiddishkeit by telling them how hard, how difficult. But people also know. People know that what is meaningful in life. Can anyone, find anything that's terribly meaningful in their lives that they didn't have to really sacrifice and do something? Yeah. And that feeling, I think Rav Soloveitchik says in terms of the Shalshudas, he talks about the third meal, where you can feel that a little, that sense of tranquility, but it only comes after this terrible torment and upheaval and conflict.
Yeah. And I think Rav Soloveitchik describes that so powerfully. But I also think that if a student sees or a colleague sees that, I'm willing to sacrifice this thing called calmness and pleasantness for this thing called faith, then it may make the other person aware of, that this thing called faith must have something to it. If this person is willing to sacrifice their menucha for this, right? If a person is willing to toil in this world, Adam la'amal yulad, right? This is an amazing verse that says that by Yisachar, it's that he saw calmness was good, and he girded his shoulders to bear the burden. What does that mean? If you see calmness is good, why bear the burden? What burden is there to bear? You want calmness. And the Baal Sulam said that really the thing that we love most in this world we give over to God. And that's our desire for calmness. We give it over to God, and we say, we're not going to find calmness. We're willing to put in the effort. And then we find menucha. When we say Jacob wanted to find peace, right? Umiyad kufsa alav rugza Yosef. There's two ways to look at it. We can say Yaakov Avinu asked for calmness in this world. And Hashem said, no, that's not your lot. Sorry, here's difficulty. Which is fine, but that's like that, capricious, almost Kafka-esque, portrayal of God that just wants to roll dice, God forbid. But then there's another way of reading that statement, which is Yaakov desired to behold the secret of calmness. How do I sit in calmness? Hashem said, you want to learn what calmness is? Here, take a really difficult situation, take a trauma, and find calmness in there, and that's how you're going to really find shalva. That it's an opportunity. Hashem is saying, you want shalva, you want to understand the secret of calmness, you're not going to find it in what you expect to be calm, you're going to find it in the struggle.
And going back to what you said before, Rabbi, about that in order for there to be a breakthrough, there has to be some kind of break, right? In order for a mother to birth a child, there is trauma. Is this also within Kabbalistic thought, the very, nature of the way God created the world?
Yeah.
Is there some? This is the
very, very fabric.
Is this connected? Is this like a leading question, I guess? But is that the concept of Shviras HaKelim, the great Kabbalistic idea of the breaking of the vessels?
I believe that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is, right? And it's also, which is the Shvirat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels, is a second stage trauma, which is a symptom, so to speak, of the original trauma, which is the tzimtzum, which is God's concealment, contraction, removal, whatever a person wants to look at it as. The two great acts of creation were traumatic ones, were a removal of something. Prior to the creation of the world, there was an infinite presence of godly light, whatever that might mean. All we know is that it's a revelation that God filled the entire world with. And in order to create a space other than God, there had to be a vacant void that emerged. And so where once God was found is suddenly made empty. A person encounters a vacuum. That's the first trauma. Then there was a desire to bring light back in, and there had to be a co-balance or a balancing act between lights, which are expressive of spirituality, and vessels, which are a metaphor, so to speak, for the receptivity of human beings of that light. And there's meant to be an equilibrium between them. But what happens is immediately we see too much light, vessels shattered. And those shattered vessels fall down into various fragments, and those comprise the very building blocks of our reality. That's exactly how it's built. Reality is the post-traumatic fragments of some original wholeness that was never meant to maintain itself. Because if it had maintained itself, then there would have never been reality. The trauma is by design.